Okay, so the next topic or the next common problem that we're going to discuss is keeping the subject and the verb close together. Now, a lot of times what we'll see is that there are phrases that interrupt the reader's attention with additional information. And I had an earlier example in one of our other topics that I left an interrupting phrase in the revision. Here are two examples on this slide, and I'll show you the example and the revision immediately together. The first one says, however, 4 other experiments found, regardless of whether hosts formed determinate or independent nodules, no such evidence. So that phrase in blue is interrupting. So technically this is not an interruption between the subject and the verb, but the phrase does interrupt the sentence and leaves the readers in suspense. So that's really the point of this problem. So if we revise this sentence, however, 4 other experiments found no such evidence, regardless of whether hosts form determinate or independent nodules. Well, that's more clear because we know what the experiments found, and then we have additional information, instead of throwing that additional information in the middle of the sentence. The second example is, several strains of UCYNB, including the widely distributed strain WH8501, have been isolated and relatively well studied. So that phrase in red interrupts between the subject, which is several strains of UCNYB, and the verb, which is have been isolated. So in the revision, we simply move that phrase to the end, just like we did in the first one. Another example is here, messenger RNA, mRNA, which is an important intermediate molecule that transports genetic codes from DNA to ribosomes for protein expression, has been suggested as a promising tool in novel therapeutic approaches for the treatment of several diseases and cancers. So this is all very good information. It's all very important. What we have here is a phrase that's defining what messenger RNA is, that's interrupting between the subject, which is messenger RNA, and the verb, which is has been suggested. And so what I would do here is break this into 2 sentences. Messenger RNA is an intermediate molecule that transports genetic codes from DNA to ribosomes for protein expression, period. Next sentence, it has been suggested as a promising tool, etc. So that makes 2 shorter sentences compared to the original 1 long sentence that had this interrupting phrase. And now it's easier to understand and more clear. The next topic is to be careful about where you put the verb. So just like separating the verb and the subject with these long interrupting phrases, it's also easier to read a verb if it's earlier in the sentence than if it's at the very end of the sentence. And when the verb of the sentence is the very last word, it has an awkward rhythm, and it makes it feel like the sentence just suddenly ended. It gives it a very abrupt ending that feels strange to the reader, and whenever I encounter such a sentence, I have to go back and reread it a second time because I'm expecting something to come after the verb. Let me show you some examples of putting the verb at the end of the sentence. However, discrepancies in the interdependency of chromosome localization among these previous studies existed. Furthermore, interactions between KIF4 and condensin 1 in the cytoplasmic fraction were investigated. Species that are more adaptable to changing environments through phenotypic plasticity and selection of adaptable traits survive. So I would revise all of these sentences if I had the opportunity, and this is how I would do the revisions. For the first one, however, there are discrepancies in the interdependency of chromosome localization among these previous studies. Okay, so I've changed the verb exists to there are. They're both state of being verbs, but I just feel like saying something exists, it just has an awkward feeling to me, so I'd prefer to say there are. For the second sentence, I revised it to say, furthermore, we investigated interactions between KIF4 and condensin 1. So I've given an agent to this sentence, and I've made it an active verb. For the third sentence, I moved survive much earlier. Species that survive are more adaptable to changing environments. So when you have that verb earlier in the sentence, it's easier for the readers to understand what it is you're trying to tell them.